Here at NASA, we all pee the same color. There's your quote for this morning. Those of you taking notes, don't forget to tag us if you tweet it out, or Facebook. We watched a movie like that, and it's a pretty powerful movie. It's an incredible scene from a movie called Hidden Figures. For those of you who haven't seen it, I really encourage you to do so. It's actually based on a true story of a group of female mathematician African-American women who are instrumental in the space race in the 1960s. And it's really incredible to watch a movie like that and see, despite their value and their worth and what they brought to the team, they very much had to fight racism in the early 60s as well, right alongside of being one of the most important people at the company at the time. And, it's easy to watch a movie like that and think, oh, we've come so far. And then, you kind of also think, well, we also are still struggling in so many ways, because quite often we just often want to be around people like us, don't we? We often want to be with people who are just like us. We want to be with people who look like us, talk like us, act like us, think like us, believe like us. We want to be around people like us. I was a campus pastor before I was here in a church in Niagara Falls, and political junkie is maybe a little strong word, it's very strong, I guess, term. But growing up in Ottawa, I think it just kind of gets in you. Where I like to follow politics, both Canadian and American politics, and in Niagara Falls, especially being so close to the border, it's very a lot of people are very interested in the American side of politics. And one of there's often kind of debates that would happen about the different sides of the political argument, and I just never wanted to kind of insert my opinions. Although I had opinions, my concern was always just whether people felt welcome at the church. And I never want to think, well, if I'm on this side, people of the other side aren't going to like my opinion. So I just kind of wanted to get rid of that altogether. But we kind of like to be around people like us, don't we? We want to be with people who just kind of look, act, think, talk like us in a lot of ways. For those of us who are Christians, sometimes we like to stay in our holy huddles, don't we? We kind of like to stay in our holy huddles and just kind of people who more or less are very much like us. There's a saying that I've heard a lot of recently. It's very something like this. It says, we have lost the ability to disagree with people without hating them or fighting with them. Have you heard something like that recently? I've heard something to that effect quite a bit the last little while. And you watch a movie like that and say, do we really ever have that ability? But certainly now, we just a lot of times when we disagree with people, we've lost the ability to just disagree, to love them and care for them, and we just disagree. A lot of times we just kind of take it to the extreme and we say, well, I'm just going to not pay attention to you because I don't agree with you. And as much as I would like to say I was so good at this, and as much as I tried not to give my opinion when it came to politics, I certainly had mine. And when people who just said something that I disagreed with, it was hard not to go, oh, you... something I won't say in church. But it was hard sometimes not to go, oh my goodness, I think you're absolutely ridiculous right now. Because we like to be around people who are like us. It makes it easier, doesn't it? It makes it easier when people think like us, act like us, talk like us, parent like us, just are like us. It makes it easier, makes it comfortable to be around that. But I think there's one thing that if we were to really do it, would change everything. I think there's one thing that could really change everything. It could change your family. It could change the landscape of our community and our country, and dare even say the world. And I'm going to say, when you hear this, it's going to sound like I'm just kind of blown out of proportion. I know he's trying to do a sermon, but he's just really kind of grasping at straws here. And I know it's going to come across that way, and it's going to be easy to kind of skim over, but I really want you to hear it because there's so much power in this one verse that I want to point to today. There's so much power. Now, I'm going to back up just a few verses before I get to that verse, just to give you a little bit of background. But I think this one verse could change everything. So Paul is in prison, and Paul he just is passionate about sharing the gospel. He's also one of those guys that he was, you cannot overstate how important he was in spreading the Christian faith. He just took over, really, sharing the gospel, and it was really because of him that it spread as it did. But sometimes I look at Paul and go, he might not be a really fun guy to be around. He just doesn't seem almost like the friendliest guy, because he's very kind of like a 100% type of guy, and he was kind of my way or the highway sometimes. So it makes it all that more incredible that he says what he's about to say. And he's in prison. He's writing to a church that he's actually never met before, but they knew him and they knew his leadership, and they were looking to him for guidance. So he's in prison, and he writes this. He says, "And pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message, so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. Pray that I may proclaim it clearly as I should." As I say, he was just passionate about sharing the gospel. "Be wise in the way you act towards outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity." We're going to get to the next verse in just a second. But I think this is great. He even says, just be wise in the way you act towards outsiders, people who are different than you. And again, if you know this guy, sometimes he was just kind of, I think when I read it, just a bit of a gruff guy, just kind of he is very passionate. And if you're not on board with him, he might just seem like he's going to run you over. But he says there's people around you who are different than you, and you need to be aware of those people. You have to be careful when you're interacting with those people. And he says this verse that I think is going to change, or could change, everything. He says, let your conversation be always full of grace. Let your conversation be always full of grace. And again, if you've read the writings of Paul, you probably think of, that seems like someone else would write this. Maybe not Paul. I mean, that seems like a Jesus thing. That's not a very nice thing that Jesus would say. But Paul was a bit of a tough guy. But he says, let your conversations be full of grace. Be always full of grace. What would your family look like if every single conversation you had was full of grace? What would your community look like? What would your workplace look like? What would our country look like if every single interaction we had was always full of grace? Unfortunately, it's not. Fortunately, it's not always full of grace. But what would it look like if we were just full of grace? Especially those who call ourselves Christians. What would it look like if every single person we interacted with, we just loved on them and showed grace? Because here's the thing. Conversation leads to connection. The more we have conversations with people, the more we connect with them. Conversations are different than just talking to someone. Conversations take time. Conversations are a lot of listening, a lot of seeking to understand, a lot of getting to know the other person. Conversations are different, but what if our conversations led to connection? I think they do. I think our conversations lead to connection, and we need to have a lot more conversations, because truth is, every relationship is based on conversations, isn't it? When you look at your relationship with your kids, or with your spouse, or with your employees, or your employer, or people you work with, it's the conversations that judge the relationship. You can look at almost any relationship, and you can have a pretty good idea of how their relationship is based on the conversations they have, because conversation leads to connection. There's a study done a few years ago that just kind of shocked me and troubled me and allowed me to kind of do a little bit of a gut check. And it was a research group by the name of the Barna Research Group, who's actually a Christian research group, and they asked this question. So can you have a natural and normal conversation with people of a different group? Can you have a natural and normal conversation with people who are basically just different than you? Can you? How good are you at that? And some of us probably really great, some of us maybe not so much, but can you do that? And then when you look at it, say, who is good at this? Who's struggling with this? And here's what they found. Evangelicals were some of the most challenged with this idea. That's a nice way of saying that Christians kind of sucked at it. That of all the people groups they looked at, of all the people that they looked at that they're interacting with other groups, Christians were some of the worst. And you kind of look at that and go, really? Really? I mean, I think, and I'm going to get to it, but I think they should be some of the best. We should be some of the best. But they found that Christians were some of the worst at it. They found that 87% of Christians would have a difficult time having a natural, normal conversation with someone who is a Muslim. They found that 85% would have a difficult time having a natural, normal conversation with someone who is an atheist. And they found that 87% of Christians would have a difficult time having a natural and normal conversation with someone of the LGBTQ community. Those numbers are staggering. They're astounding. But the fact is there's something in human nature that we like our tribes. We like to be around people like us. It's comfortable. It's fun. It's easy. It's hard to get to know people and understand people who are different than us. We like to be around people just like us. But here's the problem. Confrontation and conviction make ice. So we care about the hearts of people. We serve a God who certainly cares about the hearts of people. But far too often, Christians have a reputation of condemning and convicting and pointing out people's faults. And that heart we care so much about just gets covered in ice. Ice towards us, ice towards God, ice towards the church. It just gets so covered in ice. But here's the thing that I got to wrestle with, and I hope you wrestle with a little bit this morning. Christians have such a bad reputation of having good conversations with people, or natural, normal conversations with people. But Jesus was awesome at conversations, wasn't he? Jesus was amazing at conversations. And there's so many examples we can pull from. But Jesus just was great at connecting with people who are so different than everybody else. The people that the world, especially the religious people, wanted to condemn and point fingers at and put them in another group, Jesus was so good at connecting with them. Jesus was so good at having conversations with them, getting to know them, having a personal connection with them. As I say, there's so many examples we can look at this morning, but there's just one that I want to pull out. And it's a story about an interaction that Jesus had with a guy named Zacchaeus. And Zacchaeus was a tax collector, and he was hated for lots of different reasons, not just because we all hate paying taxes, but he was not only a tax collector, but he was often in those days, tax collectors were hired by the invading nation or the governing nation, and they would hire locals. So the locals would collect taxes from their friends and their family and neighbors and give it to the invading nation. So they were traders, not just tax collectors, they were traders. But beyond that, the nation often didn't care how much was taken, as long as they got their cut, and as long as there was enough for next time they came around, they didn't really care. So if they were supposed to collect 10%, and they collect 12, 13, 15%. They didn't really care. So the fact that Zacchaeus was a tax collector put him not only as a tax collector, but put him as a traitor and put him as a thief. I mean, he was not in a very good category when it came to the culture. Out of all the jobs you could have had, that was probably the most hated. But he hears about Jesus, and he wants to hear what all this hype is about, and he wants to hear what all these rumors are about. So he goes and seeks out Jesus. And of course, everywhere Jesus goes, a crowd gathers, and this time is no different. And Zacchaeus was a short guy, and he couldn't kind of see past the crowds, and he couldn't see above the crowd. So he decides he's going to climb this tree, and he looks to find Jesus. And this is where we pick up in the story. It says, when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him. He says, we're having lunch, and you're buying. I'm going to spend time with you. I'm going to connect with you. If there's anyone who could have condemned Zacchaeus, it was Jesus. If there's anyone who could have looked at Zacchaeus and said, Zacchaeus, you are not worthy of being here right now. If there's anyone who could have looked at Zacchaeus and said, oh my goodness, what are you doing here? You shouldn't even be in my presence. Do you want me to list in front of everybody what you've done? I mean, they know all the stuff you've done, but I can list what you've done. I can list all the ways you are not worthy. But Jesus doesn't do that, because Jesus knew the conversation breaks ice. Conversation breaks that ice that builds up when we condemn and convict. Conversation unlocks the heart. Conversation, getting to know people, interacting with them, having a relationship with them changes things. The story picks up. All the people saw this and began to mutter, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner. They say the thing that Jesus could have done, just pointing out the faults. You kind of almost think they're sitting there going, does he even know what this guy has done? Does he even get who this guy is? I mean, he just didn't pull some out of a crowd. He didn't just grab the wacky guy in the tree. I mean, does he know who this guy is? Goes on. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. See, Jesus didn't come to point out your problems. Jesus didn't come to point out what's wrong with you or what's wrong with other people. He came to seek and to save the lost. And I think one of the ways he set an example to do that is to seek through conversations. To have conversations with people who are different than us. I think he set an incredible example of that. I mean, if Jesus wanted to be around people like him, I mean, there's no one who is quite like Jesus, obviously. But maybe he could have hung around the religious people or the people who just, were so kind of, perfect inside. But Jesus goes, no. He has so many incredible interactions with people who are just disasters. But he wanted to reach them. He wanted to seek them. And he did it through conversations. So here's one of my questions I want to ask this morning. How are you interacting with people who are radically different than you? Do you like your holy huddles? Do you like people who just think the same way as you politically or have the same worldview as you, who parent the same way? Or are you going to interact with people who are radically different than you? Jesus was amazing at this. But unfortunately, some of his followers, many of his followers, myself included, suck at this sometimes. What if Christians mastered the art of conversation rather than confrontation? I can't tell you how many times I've heard stories of people turned off of church, turned off of God, turned off of Christianity, not because of Jesus, not because of God, but because they interacted with someone who claimed to be a follower of him and just didn't show any grace, any love whatsoever. What if Christians were known for what they are for rather than what they are against? See, I think Jesus came to seek and to save the lost, but I think it happens one heart and one conversation at a time. One heart and one conversation at a time. Getting to know people for who they are, building those relationships. As we wrap up, I want to share a story that was shared with me a few years ago. The story of a guy named Bill. And Bill was planning, every year they did a trip to Florida, and they were planning this year's trip to Florida. And somewhere along the way, I think it was a few months before they decided to go, they thought, hey, let's do something different this year. Let's invite some other people. Let's invite some friends of ours, and we'll make this a little bit bigger than we usually do. It's usually just our family, but we'll invite some other people this year. So it was one of those situations where they had kind of a small group that they often hung out with. There was a group of 3 families, and the parents all got along, and the kids all got along. And they just thought, hey, let's invite this group down, and we'll have a great time all together at a week down in Florida. So they do that, and they get planning and book the hotels and all that. And just before they're about to go, someone comes up with the idea, well, let's save some money. Instead of 3 of the families taking down 3 cars, let's cram in a couple cars, and we'll leave one of the cars at home. So the parents decided, well, let's all go in the car together, in one car together, and the kids, they're all university age, they'll go in a car together, and we'll go on a trip and go to Florida. So they did that. And they're having a great old time, and they're chatting, and the relationships are just growing. Even though they've known each other for years, those relationships are just being just flourishing. They're having conversations and jokes, and it's just going really well, and they're connecting with the kids every once in a while at some rest stops along the way, and they're just having a great time. They're like, I can't believe we've never done this before. And they're having a wonderful time. And Bill says, at one point on their trip, they see an accident, and it's kind of a scary accident where the car was actually flipped upside down. And I don't know what goes through your head in a situation like that, but he had a few things going through his head, he said. The first was that, I should probably stop and help. That's my first reaction. Then, some time passed, and he thought, well, there's probably someone else who is going to stop and help, and there's probably already someone who's called the police, and what can I really do? And then he kind of comes around again to, well, I need to stop and help. And this all goes through his head in a matter of a second or two. And just as he's about to press the brakes and pull over to the side of the road, his wife turns white, looks over at him, and says, "That's the kid's car. That's the kid's car." Could you imagine the thoughts going through his head then? That's the kid's car. Everyone was okay, thankfully. Some bumps and some bruises, but everybody was okay. But my point is this: relationship changes everything. Relationship changes everything. See, when we really know people, they're not projects. When we love and care about people, they're not just projects. They're not going, oh, I can pat myself on the back because I told someone about Jesus, or I, didn't tell someone off in traffic. When I really know people, they're not projects. I care about them. They're God's children, just like I am, and I care about them. When we really know people, the stakes are so much higher, because the truth is, relationship changes everything. My hope and my prayer is that all of our conversations would be full of grace. That every interaction we have with people would be full of grace. My hope for you and my hope for me as we leave here today, as we interact with people who are different than us, that we would love them, that we would try to build relationship with them, that we'd invest our time and our energy into getting to know them, because they're a child of God, just like we are. May we leave here and interact with people who are radically different than us. And may our conversations be always full of grace.